To Diep's tears streamed down her face, fragile and trembling like the rain that falls before a storm. Each drop was a cry from her soul, a plea for the family she longed to keep together. James stood frozen, his chest tightening with unbearable pain as he watched the woman he loved shatter before his eyes. In that instant, a truth struck him like lightning: he could not, and would not, let little Nee go. The thought of losing her, of watching Diep's arms empty and her smile fade, was more than he could endure. Every sacrifice he had made, every sleepless night, every battle fought, all of it was for this fragile happiness they now held in their hands. James realized that his wealth, his career, even his pride meant nothing if Diep and Nee were not by his side. With tears burning in his own eyes, James made a silent vow: no matter what stood in his way, family, fate, or fortune, he would fight. He would fight until his last breath to protect the two people who had become his entire world. For in Diep's tears, he found not despair, but the strength of love too powerful to let go. The evening sky stretched wide and low, painted with streaks of violet and fading gold. Inside the small house, the sound of Nee's laughter echoed, pure and sweet, a melody that seemed to chase away the silence. She sat on the floor, arranging wooden blocks into uneven towers, each one falling and rising again under her small, eager hands. Diep knelt beside her, gently guiding, her smile soft even as her eyes carried shadows James could not ignore. He stood at the doorway, watching them. Something in that moment pierced through him: the way Nee leaned into Diep, the way Diep brushed the child's hair from her face as if she had always been her mother. It was natural, effortless, and yet beneath it all James could feel the fragility, as if at any moment someone might step in and tear this world apart. That fear had been haunting them ever since news arrived that Nee's relatives were searching, demanding to take her back. The house had grown quieter in the nights since then. James would sometimes wake to hear Diep's muffled sobs. Hidden under her pillow, she never said a word about it, but he could see it in her swollen eyes in the mornings. Tonight, as Nee drifted to sleep, her tiny hand curled tightly around Diep's sleeve. Diep remained by her side, unwilling to move. When James approached, he saw the shimmer of tears tracing her cheek. She wiped them quickly, but it was too late. The sight of her tears hit him harder than any storm. He wanted to tell her then, to break the silence. He wanted to say the words already burning inside him: I will not let Nee go, I cannot. But something held him back. Perhaps it was the weight of responsibility, the uncertainty of what tomorrow would bring, or the fear of promising something the world might try to take from him. Still, as he reached out and brushed his hand against Diep's trembling fingers, his heart spoke louder than reason. He knew it as clearly as he knew his own breath: he could not let this child be taken from them. And yet, would he dare to tell Diep, to give her that fragile hope, knowing the storm still gathered outside their door? The night pressed in around them, heavy with unspoken words. James held her gaze, seeing her sorrow, her strength, and her quiet plea for reassurance. The choice was already made in his heart. Only one question remained: would he speak it aloud? The next morning dawned gray, the sun hidden behind a blanket of cloud. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the sky itself carried the same burden that weighed on James's heart. He moved quietly through the house, making coffee, listening to the faint sounds of Diep preparing breakfast. The clatter of bowls, the soft hum of her voice as she coaxed Nee to eat. These were ordinary sounds, yet to James they felt fragile, as if each moment might shatter if he dared to breathe too loudly. Diep carried herself with a quiet strength, but James saw what she tried to hide. The way her hand lingered on Nee's shoulder, the way her eyes followed the child with silent fear, as if every step Nee took might be the last step she could share with her. And when Nee, cheerful and unknowing, wrapped her arms around Diep's waist, Diep bent low, holding her as though she could freeze time. James could no longer stand in the shadows. He wanted to take away that fear, to wipe away every tear Diep fought to hide. He wanted to tell her, I have made my choice. Nee stays, no matter the cost. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he reached across the table, his hand brushing against hers. Diep, he said softly, She looked up, startled, her eyes shimmering with questions she could not voice. For a moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by Nee's humming as she played with her spoon. James swallowed hard. His chest ached with everything he wanted to say, everything he was afraid to promise. He could not let Nee go, but to declare it aloud meant declaring war against those who sought to take her away. And it meant binding Diep's fragile heart to a vow that might break under the world's weight. "Diep," he began again, his voice lower this time, almost trembling, "I know what she means to you." Her eyes softened, and he saw the truth spill through them: hope, fear, and an unspoken plea. His breath caught. He wanted to finish, to tell her the rest, but Nee laughed then, tipping her bowl and spilling soup across the table. The moment broke. Diep turned quickly to clean up the mess, her tears hidden once more behind her smile. James sat back, torn between relief and regret. He had not spoken the vow out loud, yet in his heart, it burned brighter than ever. He could not let Nee go. He would not. But would Diep ever know the depth of his resolve, or would his silence only deepen her sorrow? The days that followed blurred together, a fragile balance of ordinary life and unspoken fear. James kept working, his mind sharp at the office, but every phone call made his chest tighten. Every knock at the door made his pulse race. He knew it was only a matter of time before the world demanded Nee from them. One afternoon, the silence broke. A letter arrived, sealed with the weight of authority. Diep stood frozen as James read the words cold. Formal sentences that carried the threat they had both feared. The family who claimed Nee's bloodline had petitioned to take her back. They would come to see her soon. Diep's hands trembled as she reached for the paper, but James pulled her close instead. Feeling her body stiffen against his chest, he could feel her tears soaking his shirt, her breath breaking in sobs she tried to hide. She whispered, almost to herself, "She's mine, James. I can't lose her. I can't." Something inside him cracked. He had seen her tears before, silent and hidden. But now they fell openly, raw and desperate, and it tore him apart. The sight burned into him a truth he could no longer deny. He could not let Nee go, not just for himself, but for Diep, whose love for the child was deeper than words. That night, James sat awake long after Diep and Nee had fallen asleep. He watched them through the dim glow of the lamp. Diep curled protectively around the child, as if shielding her even in dreams. James's chest tightened until he could hardly breathe. He knew the risks, the battles ahead, the laws and the people standing against them, but the decision had already taken root in him. He rose quietly and stepped outside, the night air sharp against his skin. Staring up at the heavy sky, he whispered into the darkness, as if speaking to himself and to the stars above, "I won't let her go, no matter what it takes." Yet as the words left his lips, a deeper question pressed against him. Would he tell Diep? Would he give her the promise she longed to hear? Or would he carry it in silence, protecting her from hopes that might one day be shattered? The night answered with silence, leaving James caught between resolve and doubt. But one thing was certain: when the time came, he would stand between them and the world. The morning came too soon. A car rolled up the narrow road outside the house, its engine breaking the stillness of the village. James stood by the window, every muscle tense, watching as two officials stepped out, followed by a woman whose face bore the same sharp features Nee carried in softer form. Blood. Relatives. They had come. Inside, Diep clutched Nee close, her knuckles white, her body trembling as though the earth beneath her had begun to break apart. Nee, too young to understand, buried her face against Diep's chest, sensing the storm without knowing its name. James opened the door before they could knock. His expression was calm, but his eyes burned with fire. Words were exchanged, measured and heavy. The officials spoke of bloodlines, of rights, of what was best for the child. The woman reached out, her voice almost pleading, asking for Nee to come home. Behind him, James heard Diep's quiet sob, a sound that shattered him more than any argument could. He turned and saw her tears falling openly now, rolling down her cheeks as she whispered, "James, please, don't let them take her. It was in that moment that something inside him broke free. He could no longer hold his silence, no longer hide behind caution. He stepped forward, his voice steady, fierce with conviction. "She is ours," he said. "She belongs with Diep, with me. Family is not only blood, it is love, sacrifice, and the arms that held her when no one else did. You will not take her." The officials stiffened, unprepared for the force of his words. The woman's eyes widened, wavering between anger and doubt. Diep's breath caught as she looked at him, her tears shining not only with sorrow now, but with something else, hope. James moved closer to Diep, wrapping his arm around her and knee. His voice softened, but carried enough for all to hear. "I can't let her go. I won't. If you want to take her, you'll have to go through me first." For a moment, silence fell. Even the officials seemed shaken by the depth of his resolve. The woman looked at me, at Diep, at James, at the unbreakable bond that no paper or law could erase. Slowly, she lowered her hand. The visitors left with words of delay, of further discussion, but James no longer heard them. He felt Diep trembling against him, felt Nee's tiny hands clutching his shirt, and he knew the truth was finally spoken when the car disappeared down the road. Diep looked up at him through her tears. "James, you said it. You told them." He pressed his forehead to hers, his voice low but steady. "I told them because I told myself first. I can't let her go, Diep. Not now, not ever." And for the first time in many nights, her tears fell not only from sorrow, but from the fragile, trembling relief of knowing she was not alone. The tears of Diep and the courage of James teach us that family is not measured only by blood, but by love, sacrifice, and the bonds we choose to protect. Sometimes life presents us with choices that test the deepest parts of our hearts. In those moments, silence may feel safer, but truth spoken with love can become the shield that guards what matters most. Nee's innocence reminds us that every child deserves not just a home, but a place where love surrounds them. James's decision to stand firm shows that real strength is not in contracts or titles, but in the promise to protect the people we cannot live without. The lesson is clear: when love is true, it demands courage, and when courage meets love, even the strongest forces cannot tear a family apart. Life often tests us in ways we never expect. For James and Diep, the challenge was not only about keeping Nee safe, but about facing their own fears of loss and the unknown. Through their struggle, we learn that true love is not passive, it acts, it speaks, and it protects, even when the outcome is uncertain. Diep's tears remind us that vulnerability is not weakness. Sometimes, it is through our tears that the people who love us most finally understand the weight we carry. And James's courage teaches us that protection does not always mean fighting battles with force. It also means standing firmly in truth, refusing to let go of the people who make life worth living. The story also shows us the importance of trust. When Diep chose to believe in James, and when James chose to speak from his heart, a fragile but powerful bond grew even stronger. Trust can transform fear into hope and despair into strength. In the end, the greatest lesson is this: love that is chosen, protected, and spoken aloud is stronger than blood, law, or circumstance. It is love that builds families, love that heals wounds, and love that carries us through the darkest nights into the light of tomorrow.